all kinds of explosions that happen in space. But today I'm going to be talking about viruses. So let's get an idea as to what we're going to be talking about with looking at scales of the universe. So in general, at these meetings, you'll talk about things that are on the scale of stars and planets. So gigameters in size, and or planets which are substantially smaller than stars are in Minecraft. And if we zoom further and further down to smaller and smaller size scales, we get to the sizes of moons and towards countries, and keep getting smaller and smaller. We eventually start getting to things that we might recognize, like mountains, Uluru, and some buildings now at 1,000 meters, so 1 kilometer in size now. Smaller still, we get to organic things like big trees, dinosaurs, and all the way down to a 1 meter scale, we get to very familiar things like people and basketballs. But we need to go even smaller if we want to talk about viruses like we do today. So zooming past ants, going smaller and smaller, we're getting very small now, but we're still not on the size of viruses. So now we're going on the size of DNA, even smaller still. And we finally end up in the domain of viruses. These viruses are incredibly small, 10 to the minus 6 meters or a micrometer. They're incredibly interesting objects and incredibly complicated objects. And today we're going to go through viruses 101 to give you an idea of what viruses are, how they operate, how they fit into all the trouble that's going on at the moment. So before we go into viruses, let's first look at the structure of an ordinary cell. So the key takeaway, I guess, is that there are lots of things that are inside of a cell. So we're made out of millions upon millions of cells, and in each side of each of these cells will have stuff like this. So we'll have the nucleus, which contains the DNA, which tells the cell everything it needs to do. Around the nucleus, you'll have this funny thing called an endoplasmic reticulum, which does a lot of stuff around making proteins and things that the cell needs to survive. And a very important thing is these little dots scattered throughout the cell. Those are known as ribosomes. And those ribosomes are very important because they're used to make proteins that are essential for the cells to work, and a whole lot of other things. So cells are very complex. They've got a lot of these organ things inside them called organelles, and they're capable of doing lots of things, one of those things being replicate themselves. But if we go to look at a virus, it's much simpler. You only have a few different things. One, you have an envelope which surrounds the virus, and this envelope is made out of a bilipid layer. So it's like the same as the cell membrane that sits around this, say, human cell, but it's kind of stolen. We'll get into that later. And then we have this thing, a capsid, which is kind of the storage facility for the information that this virus contains. So a virus has a genome, which can be DNA or RNA. So if you don't know what a DNA strand is, it's just a very long piece of information that tells you everything that that cell should do. And in the case of RNA, it's a simpler version of DNA, which can change more easily than DNA and make copies of itself pretty easily as well. So you notice that this is a lot simpler than a cell or a human cell, and this virus cell can't really do too much. All it's got is a protective layer and some information hidden inside of it. So what do these viruses do? Well, they do a lot of damage to cells. So this is the inside of a, say, human cell, the cell nucleus is in the middle, and we have some DNA that comes spilling out of the nucleus. They go into the ribosomes to get made into proteins, which can then be used to manufacture proteins and structures inside of cells, or to be moved about to other cells. And the insides of cells are extremely complex, as we only touched on. The simple virus needs to find its way to a cell, and then, because it has nothing else it can do really, it needs to make its way inside of a cell, much like a Trojan horse, really. So it finds its way inside of the cell and then makes its way to the nucleus of the cell, where it begins taking over the cell entirely. So it releases all of its DNA or RNA, and they hijack the ribosomes to make proteins, not for the original cell, but to make new viruses. So the virus uses the machinery of the cell to clone itself into many thousands of copies. Then it uses the cell's membrane to stop cells or stop new viruses so they can go about and infect more cells. So these viruses are incapable of making more viruses by themselves. They need to hijack another cell to do those things. And it's that hijacking of cells which makes them kind of dangerous, because they're completely overwriting what the cell should be doing and giving it new instructions which are completely useless for, say, a larger organism to function properly. So it's worth noting, though, that all viruses aren't bad. There are things like bacteriophages, which Kurzgesagt did a really good video on, which look like strange alien spaceships. And these things mostly hunt down bacteria and infect them to create more viruses, but they are not dangerous to us. In fact, there are lots of researchers who are working on trying to make bacteriophages into new treatments. If antibiotics fail, these viruses might end up saving lives. So not all viruses are bad, it's just strange new ones that we haven't encountered before can be quite dangerous. That brings us to the modern news, this COVID-19 virus. This is a very modern virus. It's only emerged within the past couple of months. And there's been a whole lot of research to try and understand what this virus is and how it's behaving and what it will do. And the origin of this virus is also not particularly known at this point. There are a few different possibilities. One is that it came from this cute little creature here, a pangolin. Another possibility is that it came from a bat. So it's worth noting that humans aren't the only organisms to get viruses. These two creatures here also get viruses, along with pretty much everything else. In general, the viruses stay to that animal, and it doesn't really affect any other organism. But in rare cases, you can have viruses jumping between species and causing a lot of problems. And that's what we've had here with this COVID-19. So going back to that video before, this is taken by the Hong Kong Medical University, I think, of the COVID-19 virus doing what we saw in that video before. We have a free-flowing virus sitting here, and you start one here that's starting to interact with the cell. This one which is starting to be absorbed by the cell and take it over, and here's another one which is further along in the absorbing process. So this virus does, as we just saw, it will hijack a cell and use it to make new viruses, which can then go on and infect other cells. So how do these viruses spread? We talked about how they spread within an organism. It will hijack a cell and then it will go between the cells and get more cells. But how does it go from person to person? How can I send a virus from me to someone else? Well, for this virus in particular, there's two main ways. There's sneezing, and then there's coughing. So you want to make sure that if you're sneezing and coughing, you don't direct it towards anyone or anything, because a virus can live inside of your sneeze and coughs, and they can also live on surfaces for, in some cases, a few days. So you need to be careful with these actions. So that's how these viruses get around, but we're not completely defenseless to these viruses. Our bodies are very interesting objects and they're very complicated, but researchers have been able to find out how the virus actually is combated by the body's immune system. This is just a little schematic drawing of how that happens. So within our bodies, we have lots of different cells that do different things. The blue cell on the top line is what we call an immature T cell. And these cells are kind of the first stage of immune response. They can't really do anything, they're not that specialized, but they can go around and check cells and seeing if they behave properly. And if they're infected with the virus, there'll be some kind of telltale sign, an antigen, which indicates that the cell is no longer functioning. So these T cells can do two different things. They can turn into a CD4 plus cell, a very interesting and exciting name, or a helper T cell, which can then make more antigens to help activate other immune responses or identify more cells that are infected. Or a T cell can turn into a CD8 plus, another fantastic name, or a cytotoxic cell. And cytotoxic just means that this cell can go around and destroy and consume infected cells. So this is the primary mechanism that our body has for fending off these viral infections. And it's the same response it has for a flu is what it's using to fend off this new COVID-19 virus. So even without having recognized this virus before, our bodies are well equipped to defend themselves. But this is within our body. Ideally, we don't want the virus or any virus getting within us. So the question becomes, how can we stop viruses from getting in our own bodies? So you may have heard people telling you to wash your hands with soap an awful lot. And I'll just explain how this works here. So on this blue object with a ball and a stick is kind of a soap molecule. The big ball end is the polar end that likes to be around water. And the stick end is what we call non-polar, or it hates to be around water. And we have over here on the right-hand side a virus, and this virus has a similar kind of thing. It has this membrane that surrounds the sensitive parts called the bilipid layer. And what happens is that the piece of soap will run along and wedge itself into the bilipid layer, and other pieces of soap do that, and it acts to break down the bilipid layer, or the shell protecting the virus, exposing it and destroying it. So viruses can live for long times outside of the human body because they're protected by this bilipid layer. If you break that down with soap, they degrade very quickly. So soap is a very powerful tool in protecting us from viruses like the coronavirus. So just to summarize this stuff, how to avoid this strange new virus. You've probably heard a lot of this already. One is to cough and sneeze into your elbow to make sure that if you have the virus, you don't send it to people that currently don't have it, or put it on surfaces that people might end up touching. And you also want to avoid touching your face, because if you have touched something and gotten the virus on your hand and go to touch your face, you can transmit the virus in through your eyes or mouth. So it's just something to be aware of. And as I said before, wash your hands regularly with soap, because you can break down the virus's protective layer and kill it very effectively by using soap. And another thing which is very useful, which Marnik and Tim were doing before, is social distancing. So being mindful of how close you are to other people, because they potentially could have a virus. But social distancing is a very important tool, which will be discussed more by James now. So I'll pass over to James.